Some stories don't start with birth. They begin with a choice. And mine began when I was just 3 years old. I don't remember my first day of school, but I remember the smell of her apron, the way she'd hum while brushing my hair, and most of all how she chose me when no one else did. She didn't have money. She didn't speak perfect English. But she had something no paperwork could measure, a heart big enough to raise a child who wasn't hers. For 14 years, she was my home, my family, my everything. Until one cold morning, when ICE knocked on our door at 5 a.m. and tried to take her away. I was 17 when everything changed. It was a freezing morning in December, just days before winter break. The sky was still dark when I heard pounding at the door, loud, fast, terrifying. At first, I thought it was a mistake, or maybe a break-in. But then I saw the uniforms, ICE agents, 3 of them, standing in our living room with unreadable faces, armed with folders and fear. They asked for Maria Hernandez. That's my mom. But the way they said her name, it felt like they weren't talking about a person. It sounded more like a case file, like a problem to be removed. Not the woman who stayed up every night helping me with math homework. Not the woman who worked double shifts at the diner just to buy me books I didn't even ask for. She stood in front of me like a shield, already shaking, already knowing. She had always feared this moment. We didn't talk about it often, but it was always there like a shadow in our lives. She came to the U.S. when she was 22. No papers, just hope. She fled violence in her hometown in Mexico and started over with nothing but her hands and heart. Years later, she adopted me through a private domestic process. She gave me her last name, her home, her love, but she never received legal protection for herself. She was always in the system, but never fully seen by it. And now the system was here, asking her to leave everything behind in 10 minutes or less. I remember the panic rising in my chest. I screamed, I begged, I asked why. The answer was, cold and rehearsed. She has a removal order from years ago. We're just doing our job. But they didn't know what she meant to me. They didn't know how many birthdays she made, special with homemade cakes, how many nights she held me when I had nightmares. They didn't know that she was my whole world. I asked if I could go with her. They said no. I said she was my legal guardian. They said it didn't matter. She's undocumented, one agent said flatly. She doesn't belong here. And in that moment, something in me snapped. I ran to her. I held onto her waist so tightly that one of the officers actually paused. I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe, screaming, "If you take her, you'll have to take me too. I won't let you do this. I won't let you take my mother." My mom kept trying to calm me down. Her hands were on my face. Her voice was breaking. "Please don't make this harder," she said. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. Neighbors started coming out of their homes. Some people were filming. Others were shouting. I heard someone yell, "That's her daughter! That's her daughter!" It felt like the world had turned upside down. A woman who raised me with everything she had was now being torn away in front of strangers, like her love, her sacrifices, her entire life. Didn't matter. I was no longer just a scared teenager. I was her daughter ready to fight, I told. The agents, she had a community. She had people who loved her. She had a church, a job, a life. I told them about the petition, about the letters from my school principal, our pastor, even her employer, all pleading for her to stay. None of it seemed to matter to them, and that's when I collapsed onto the ground. In front of the van, I wrapped myself around her and screamed so loud that my voice gave out. I didn't care if they arrested me. I didn't care if it ruined my future, because they were trying to erase the only person who ever believed in mine. I Don't remember how long I stayed on the ground, clinging to her. Time blurred. My fingers were numb. My voice was gone. But I didn't move. And neither did they. The ICE agents kept repeating the same sentence. Miss, you need to let go. But how do you let go of the only person who's ever held you together? People kept coming. Neighbors, classmates, even my mom's boss from the diner still in her apron, rushed to our driveway. Someone must have called the local news, because within an hour, a camera crew showed up. The whole block was watching now. And, for the first time, the agents seemed unsure. One of them stepped away, started making calls. The others stood guard, but they didn't push me. Not yet. Then something strange happened. A woman I barely knew stepped forward. She was from our church. She held a yellow envelope in her hand and said, "This is for her case." Inside were over 300 signatures from people in the community. People who had eaten at the diner. People who saw how my mom took care of me like I was her blood. People who wanted her to stay. Of the agents took the envelope, looked confused, then walked back to the van to radio someone. I could hear him saying words like public attention and media presence. That's when I realized something. They weren't just fighting us. They were now being watched. And the story was no longer theirs to control. The minutes stretched. Like hours, they kept asking me to step aside. My mom begged me quietly to stop. Her voice cracked, her whole body trembling. "Don't let them hurt you," she whispered. But I saw something in her eyes that terrified me more than anything. Resignation. She was ready to go. Not because she didn't want to stay, but because she didn't want to be the reason I got hurt. That's when I stood up, not because I was giving up, but because I realized I had to fight smarter. I walked over to the news camera and told them everything. I told them about my adoption, about the nights my mom stayed up sewing clothes to afford my field trips, about how she made a home for me when I had no one. I told them that the system had failed us both because it had never even seen us as a real family. The reporter nodded. She didn't stop the camera. Within minutes, the video was online. Comments exploded. People started sharing it. Strangers were calling the immigration hotline, asking for a stay on the deportation. Then, an unexpected call came in. One of the ICE agents answered, walked away for a moment, and came back with a look that wasn't anger, but discomfort. He sighed, "We're suspending the detention. There's going to be an emergency hearing in 2 weeks. Your mother is not being deported today." I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was a trick. But then they opened the van, and she stepped out, still handcuffed, still terrified, but free. We hugged like we'd never hugged before. She was crying. I was shaking. The crowd erupted into applause, but all I could. Here was her heartbeat against mine. They gave us a temporary release order. 15 days. That's all we had to prepare for court. 15 days to prove that love, community, and motherhood were worth more than a broken system's red tape. But we weren't alone anymore. The church offered to pay for legal help. My school counselor contacted a nonprofit that works with families facing deportation. Lawyers volunteered to take the case. Even the diner where my mom worked held a fundraiser to help with legal fees. And most shockingly, my biological aunt, who I hadn't heard from in years, reached out after seeing the video. She said, "I didn't know you had someone like that in your life. Tell me what I can do to help." In those 15 days, we rebuilt everything the government tried to tear apart. We collected testimony from teachers, doctors, community leaders. We submitted psychological reports showing the trauma I'd suffer if she were removed. We gathered photos, journals, adoption records, everything that proved she was my real mother, even if the law tried to say otherwise. And during all of this, I watched her carry herself with grace. She still cooked for me, still whispered prayers over my bed every night, still wiped away my tears, even though she had so many of her own. The day of the hearing finally came. We sat in that courtroom like it was the edge of a cliff. My mom wore her best dress. I held her hand the entire time. When the judge entered, my stomach dropped. He looked stern, tired, like a man who had seen, too, many cases like ours, too many families torn apart. He read the documents in silence, listened to our lawyer, listened to the government's arguments, and then he looked at me. "You were adopted at age 3?" he asked. I nodded. "And she's been your only parent since then?" I swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. She's my mother. In every way that matters." There was a pause, a long one. And then he said something I'll never forget. This country often fails to recognize the bonds that truly make a family. But today, I won't be part of that failure. I'm granting a humanitarian stay while we review the permanent residency petition. The courtroom gasped. My knees buckled. My mom collapsed into my arms. We didn't win everything that day. She wasn't given citizenship, not yet. But she was given the one thing we needed most. Time. In the days after the hearing, everything felt ... still. We weren't celebrating, not exactly. There was no champagne, no parade, just quiet and gratitude, and exhaustion that ran deep into our bones. But underneath it all was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. That night, as we sat on the couch eating leftover soup, I turned to my mom and said, "Did you ever think we'd get this far?" She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "No." But I never stopped praying. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone, was that in the chaos leading up to the hearing, I'd found something hidden in her closet, a small wooden box with my name carved on the lid. Inside were photos of me at every stage of life, drawings I made in kindergarten, my baby teeth wrapped in tissues, even a copy of the very first letter she wrote when she started the adoption process. But the thing that broke me was the note she'd written night before ICE came. It was addressed to me. "If they take me, don't stop living. If I can't, come back. Know that I loved you more than life itself. And if you have to grow without me, do it bravely. I didn't give you my name to make you mine. I gave it to remind you that you are always worth fighting for." I never told her I found that letter. I didn't need to. I just held it close every time I felt like falling apart. That discovery changed something in me. It wasn't just about stopping her deportation anymore. It was about giving her the life she deserved to live. So I started making plans. I applied to colleges I once thought were too far out of reach. I began speaking at immigrant rights rallies. I shared our story, not to be a victim, but to show the world what love can do when it refuses to give up. People started messaging us from across the country, other kids with undocumented parents, other moms who adopted children outside the system. They said our story gave them strength. Some even started fighting their own deportation cases with our story in their hands. One day, a woman knocked on our door. She was a social worker who had seen our story online. She told us about a visa pathway for immigrant caregivers who have provided long-term family care, especially in adoption cases. She said, "It's not easy, but you have a chance." So we gathered more evidence, filed a humanitarian application, waited months holding our breath every time the mail arrived. Then, one afternoon, we got the letter. Application accepted. Review in progress. No deportation action pending. It wasn't citizenship, but it was safety. It was time. It was enough to start breathing again, and that's when we truly began to rebuild. We repainted the walls of our home. We planted a small garden, just herbs at first. We started hosting dinners again. My mom laughed more, cooked more, sang in the kitchen like she used to. I saw her come back to life. But the biggest moment came one morning when I received an acceptance letter from a law school that had once felt like a distant dream. I showed it to her, heart racing. She read it in silence, then looked up at me and said, "You're going to help people like me, aren't you?" I nodded. People like us. That was the moment I realized this story wasn't just about what we survived. It was about what we were becoming. Because the truth is, love like hers doesn't just raise a child. It builds warriors. It sparks revolutions. It teaches you that sometimes silence is not an option, that kneeling in front of a van may feel like the end, but it can be the beginning of something much bigger.